Thomas Mitchell pushed open the glass door of Danny's diner and heard the familiar bell ring above his head. It was exactly 7:30 in the morning, just like every Tuesday for the past 3 years. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee filled the air as he walked to his usual table in the corner by the window. Marie looked up from behind the counter and smiled. She had been working at the diner for 15 years and knew all the regular customers. Thomas was one of her favorites. He always said please and thank you, never complained about anything, and left good tips even when he only ordered coffee. "Morning, Thomas," Marie called out as she grabbed the coffee pot. "The usual today." Thomas nodded and sat down in his chair. He always sat facing the door. It was a habit he had developed long ago, though no one in the small town of Millfield knew why. He pulled off his navy blue cap and set it on the table next to him. The cap was old and worn, with a small pin on the front that most people never really looked at closely. Marie brought over his coffee in the white ceramic mug he always used. She noticed he had the morning newspaper folded under his arm like always. Thomas was probably the only person under 80 who still bought the actual paper instead of reading news on his phone. "You heading to the Veterans Day thing later?" Marie asked as she poured the steaming coffee. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied quietly. "Same as every year." Marie had always wondered about Thomas. He was polite and well-dressed, but there was something different about him. He had a way of watching everything around him without seeming to stare. His hands were rough like someone who had worked hard, but he spoke like an educated man. And there was something about his eyes that made her think he had seen more of the world than most folks in their little town. Thomas ordered his usual breakfast: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and bacon. He ate slowly while reading his paper, occasionally looking up to watch the morning crowd. The diner was busy with people heading to work and school. Farmers in dirty boots sat next to businessmen in ties. Everyone seemed to know everyone else except for Thomas. He was friendly but kept to himself. At the table next to him, 2 elderly men were talking loudly about the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony. One of them, a man named Frank, had served in Vietnam. The other, Joe, had been in the Gulf War. They came to the diner every morning and always ended up talking about their military days. "You should come sit with us sometime, Thomas," Frank called over. "Marie says you go to the ceremony every year. You serve?" Thomas looked up from his newspaper and gave a small smile. "Navy," he said simply, then went back to reading. Frank and Joe exchanged glances. That was about as much as Thomas ever said about himself. They had tried many times to get him to talk more about his service, but he always changed the subject or gave short answers. Some of the locals had started to wonder if maybe Thomas was making up his military background. After all, he never told war stories like other veterans did. What Frank and Joe did not know was that Thomas had very good reasons for staying quiet about his past. There were things he had done and places he had been that he could never talk about. Not because he was ashamed, but because some secrets had to stay secret forever. Even in retirement, even in a small town where nothing important ever seemed to happen, Thomas kept his mouth shut about the 32 years he had spent serving his country in ways that regular people could never imagine. Thomas finished his breakfast and left his usual $5 tip on a $12 meal. He stood up and put his navy cap back on his head. The morning sun was getting brighter outside, and he could see people starting to set up chairs and decorations in the town square for the afternoon ceremony. "See you later, Marie," he said as he walked toward the door. "Have a good day, Thomas, and thank you for your service." Thomas paused at the door and looked back at her. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Maybe sadness, maybe pride, maybe something else entirely. Then he smiled and nodded. "Thank you, ma'am." Thomas stepped outside into the cool morning air and started walking toward the town square. He moved with purpose but without hurry, his leather shoes making soft sounds on the sidewalk. A few people waved at him as he passed. The mailman, old Mrs. Peterson watering her flowers, the guy who ran the hardware store. Thomas waved back, politely but kept walking. When he reached the town square, he stopped to watch the volunteers setting up for the ceremony. A young man was struggling with the microphone and speaker system. Thomas watched for a minute, then quietly walked over. "Mind," If I take a look, Thomas asked. The young man, whose name was Jake, looked relieved. Please do. This thing has been giving me trouble all morning. Thomas examined the equipment for about 30 seconds, then made a few quick adjustments. He plugged in a loose cable, adjusted some settings, and tested the microphone. His movements were quick and sure, like someone who had worked with communications equipment many times before. There you go, Thomas said, handing the microphone back to Jake. Jake tested it and smiled when his voice came through loud and clear. Wow, thanks. Mister, you really know your stuff? Are you in the military? Thomas was already walking away. He called back over his shoulder. As Thomas continued his walk around the square, he noticed something that made him stop. Across the street, near the old courthouse, a man in a military uniform was talking to a group of teenagers. The man was speaking loudly and gesturing wildly, obviously telling some kind of exciting story. Thomas moved closer, staying far enough away that he could not be easily seen, but close enough to hear what was being said. What he heard made his jaw tighten and his hands clench into fists. The man was claiming to be a Navy SEAL. He was telling the kids about secret missions and brave acts of heroism that sounded like something from a movie. But Thomas could tell immediately that everything about this man was wrong. His uniform did not fit properly. The ribbons and medals were in the wrong places. The insignia was completely incorrect for someone with his claimed rank and service record. Thomas had seen the real thing too many times to be fooled. He had worked alongside actual Navy SEALs on missions that these teenagers would never hear about. He had watched real heroes come home broken or not at all, and now this fake soldier was standing in front of children, lying about service he had never given and valor he had never shown. Thomas pulled out his cell phone and dialed the local police station. When someone answered, he spoke quietly but clearly. This is Thomas Mitchell. I'm at the courthouse square and I would like to report a case of stolen valor. There is a man here in an incorrect military uniform making false claims about his service. Thomas gave a detailed description of the fake soldier and his exact location. Then he hung up and started walking toward the Veterans Day ceremony setup. He had done his duty as a citizen. Now the police could handle it. What Thomas did not know was that his phone call was about to start a chain of events that would turn his quiet morning into the most dramatic day of his retirement. Within an hour, he would be sitting in handcuffs, while the real criminal continued his lies just 2 blocks away. The man who had spent decades protecting his country in secret was about to become the center of a very public misunderstanding. Officer Danny Rodriguez adjusted his radio as he walked quickly toward his patrol car. He had been with the Millfield Police Department for only 8 months, and every call still felt important to him. The stolen valor report had come in just 10 minutes ago, and Danny was determined to handle it perfectly. Danny was 24 years old and had dreamed of being a police officer since he was a kid. He had graduated from the police academy at the top of his class and moved to Millfield because he wanted to serve a small community where he could really make a difference. His training officers had told him that stolen valor cases were tricky, and that fake soldiers often had convincing stories and realistic-looking uniforms. As Danny drove toward the courthouse square, he listened carefully to the radio dispatch. The caller had reported an elderly man in military clothing making false claims about his service. The description was somewhat unclear, but Danny wrote down the key details in his notebook. Elderly male, military attire, near Courthouse Square, possibly wearing medals or insignia. When Danny arrived at the square, he parked his patrol car and started looking around. There were several people setting up for the Veterans Day ceremony, and he could see a few older men in the area. Then he spotted Thomas Mitchell walking slowly along the sidewalk, wearing his Navy cap and a jacket that had what looked like military pins on the lapel. Danny had never seen Thomas before, which was not unusual since he was still new to town. To the young officer, Thomas looked exactly like the suspect description he had been given, an older man in military clothing near the courthouse square. Danny did not know that Thomas was actually the person who had made the phone call in the first place. Danny approached Thomas with his hand resting near his radio, just like he had been taught in training. His heart was beating faster than usual. This was only his 3rd stolen valor case, and he wanted to do everything by the book. "Excuse me, sir," Danny called out as he walked quickly to catch up with Thomas. I need to speak with you for a moment. Thomas turned around, looking puzzled but not worried. He assumed the police had arrived to deal with the fake soldier he had reported. He expected the officer to ask him some questions as a witness, or maybe to point out where he had seen the imposter. "Of course, officer," Thomas said politely. "How can I help you?" Danny pulled out his notebook and pen. "Sir, I received a report about someone making false claims about military service in this area. I need to ask you some questions about your military background." Thomas felt confusion wash over him. Why was the officer questioning him instead of looking for the fake soldier? "I think there might be some misunderstanding, officer. I called in the report about 20 minutes ago. The man you are looking for is over by the courthouse in an incorrect Navy SEAL uniform." But Danny had been trained to expect exactly this kind of response. His instructors had told him that people caught committing stolen valor often tried to deflect attention by claiming they were witnesses or that someone else was the real criminal. To Danny, Thomas seemed to be following the textbook pattern of a guilty person trying to avoid responsibility. "Sir, I need to see some identification and documentation of your military service," Danny said, his voice becoming more official. Thomas reached into his wallet and pulled out his driver's license and his military ID card. The ID card was real, but it looked different from the standard veteran cards that Danny was used to seeing. Thomas's card had special markings and codes that indicated his intelligence background, but Danny did not recognize what they meant. Danny examined the cards carefully. To his inexperienced eye, the military ID looked almost too perfect. The photo was clear, the information was detailed, and the card itself seemed to be made of higher quality material than he expected. His training had warned him that professional con artists often had very convincing fake documents. "Sir, can you tell me about your military service?" Danny asked, still looking at the ID card. Thomas began to explain that he had served in the Navy for 32 years, mostly in intelligence work, but he could not go into details about his actual assignments because most of his service record was still classified. To Thomas, this seemed like a reasonable explanation. To Danny, it sounded like someone making up vague stories to avoid giving specific details. "Intelligence work," Danny repeated, writing in his notebook. "Can you tell me what specific units you served with?" Thomas hesitated. He could not name most of the units he had worked with because they were classified operations that officially did not exist. The few things he could talk about would not sound very impressive compared to the fake heroic stories that stolen valor criminals usually told. "I mostly did administrative and communications work," Thomas said carefully. "Nothing very exciting." Danny felt more confident that he had caught a faker. Real military heroes usually had specific stories and details they were proud to share. This man seemed to be trying to downplay his service, which Danny interpreted as a sign that he was making things up and trying not to get caught in lies. The situation got worse when more people started to gather around. Frank and Joe from the diner had walked over from their morning coffee and recognized Thomas. Some of the volunteers setting up the Veterans Day ceremony had also stopped to watch what was happening. "Hey, that's Thomas from the diner," Frank said loudly. "What's going on, officer?" Danny felt pressure to resolve the situation quickly with so many people watching. He had been trained that stolen valor cases needed to be handled decisively to maintain respect for real veterans. In his mind, he was protecting the honor of genuine military heroes by stopping this fraud. "Sir, I believe you are impersonating a military service member," Danny said in a clear voice that carried across the growing crowd. "I am placing you under arrest for stolen valor." The crowd of onlookers gasped in shock. Thomas stood perfectly still, his face showing disbelief but not panic. He had been in much more dangerous situations than this, but never one where he was the person being accused of a crime he did not commit. "Officer, I think you are making a serious mistake," Thomas said calmly. "If you would just look for the man I reported or call your supervisor, we can clear this up very quickly." But Danny was now committed to his decision. He had announced the arrest in front of witnesses, and backing down would make him look foolish and uncertain. He pulled out his handcuffs and approached Thomas. "Sir, please turn around and put your hands behind your back." Thomas looked at the young officer's determined face and realized that arguing would only make things worse. He had spent decades following orders, even when he disagreed with them. He turned around and allowed Danny to handcuff him. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Thomas Mitchell, the quiet man who had been their neighbor for 3 years, was placed under arrest. Marie from the diner had walked over to see what the commotion was about and could not believe what she was seeing. "There has to be some mistake," she called out. "Thomas is a good man. He would never lie about serving his country." Danny ignored the comments from the crowd and began reading Thomas his rights. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the Miranda warning continued, Thomas kept his dignity intact. He did not struggle or argue or make a scene. He simply stood quietly with his hands cuffed behind his back, looking like a man who had learned long ago how to endure difficult situations with grace. Frank and Joe looked at each other in confusion. They had always wondered about Thomas's background, but seeing him arrested for lying about military service seemed impossible. The man they knew was respectful, humble, and never bragged about anything. Danny led Thomas toward the patrol car, feeling satisfied that he had handled his first major arrest professionally. He had no idea that he was about to become part of the most embarrassing mistake in Millfield Police Department history. And just 2 blocks away, the real stolen valor criminal was still telling his fake war stories to anyone who would listen, completely unaware that someone else was being arrested for his crime. As the patrol car drove away toward the police station, Thomas looked out the window at the town square where the Veterans Day ceremony preparations continued. In a few hours, there would be speeches about honoring those who served their country. Thomas had served for over 3 decades, had been wounded in action, and had received commendations from 3 presidents. But now he was heading to jail, accused of being a fake soldier by someone young enough to be his grandson. Thomas Mitchell sat quietly on the hard bench in the holding cell at the Millfield police station. His navy cap rested beside him, and his hands were folded calmly in his lap. The cell was small and smelled like disinfectant, but Thomas had been in much worse places during his 32 years of service. Other men might have been angry or scared, but Thomas simply waited. He had learned long ago that panic never solved problems. Instead, he used the time to think about his next moves. He had been allowed 1 phone call, and he had used it to contact his lawyer in the state capitol. But what he really wanted was to call his old friend Admiral Rebecca Hayes. Thomas had not spoken to Rebecca in over a year, but he knew she would still remember him. They had worked together on several classified operations during the Cold War, and she had been one of the few people who knew the full extent of his service record. Rebecca was retired now, but still had connections throughout the naval intelligence community. The problem was that Thomas Mitchell was not just any veteran. For 32 years, he had served in naval intelligence, working on operations that were so secret they did not officially exist. His real service record was locked away in classified files that required special clearance just to access. Most of his missions had been deep cover work in hostile countries, gathering intelligence that helped prevent wars and save lives. After retiring 5 years ago, Thomas had deliberately chosen to live quietly in Millfield. He told his neighbors only that he was former Navy, never mentioning the details that could never be shared. He had earned dozens of medals and commendations, but most of them were classified awards that the public would never hear about. At the front desk, Officer Danny Rodriguez was filling out paperwork and feeling proud of his arrest. He had caught what appeared to be a very convincing stolen valor case. The suspect had seemed calm and reasonable, which Danny interpreted as the behavior of an experienced con artist who had been through this before. Danny wrote in his report that the suspect had claimed to work in intelligence, which sounded like typical fake soldier exaggeration. Real intelligence work was probably boring office jobs, Danny reasoned, not the exciting spy stuff that movies made it look like. The suspect had been vague about his service details, which Danny saw as proof that he was making everything up. Sergeant Lisa Parker walked into the station after finishing her patrol shift. Lisa had been with the Millfield Police Department for 20 years and had seen every kind of case that small-town police work could offer. She was known for being thorough and careful, and younger officers often came to her for advice. "What have we got, Danny?" Lisa asked as she looked at the paperwork on his desk. Stolen valor case, Danny replied with confidence. Elderly male claiming to be former Navy intelligence. Had fake-looking ID and kept changing his story when I questioned him. Lisa looked through Danny's notes and frowned slightly. Something about the case seemed unusual, though she could not put her finger on what bothered her. Did you run his ID through the federal database? She asked. Danny shook his head. I checked for criminal history and outstanding warrants. He came back clean, but that does not mean the military ID is real. Lisa had handled several stolen valor cases over the years, and they usually involved people with criminal backgrounds or obvious mental health issues. This case seemed different. The suspect had been cooperative, well-dressed, and apparently had no prior arrests. Most fake soldiers were caught because they bragged about their fake service. This man had actually seemed reluctant to talk about his military background. Let me run a more detailed check, Lisa said, sitting down at her computer terminal. What was his name again? Thomas Mitchell, Danny replied, reading from his notes. Lisa typed the name into the federal military verification system. This was a deeper database that most small-town police departments rarely used. But Lisa had access because of her years of experience and security clearance from her own military background. She had served 4 years in the Army before becoming a police officer. At first, the search seemed normal. Thomas Mitchell's basic information appeared on the screen, confirming his identity and showing that he was indeed a military veteran. But then something strange happened. Instead of showing his service details, the screen displayed a message that Lisa had never seen before. The message read, "Classified access required. Contact Naval Intelligence immediately for verification." Lisa stared at the screen in disbelief. In 20 years of police work and 4 years in the Army, she had never encountered a military record that required special clearance just to view basic service information. She tried running the search again, thinking maybe there had been a computer error. The same message appeared. "Danny," Lisa called out, her voice sounding worried. "You need to come look at this." Danny walked over to Lisa's computer and read the message on the screen. "What does that mean?" he asked. "I have no idea," Lisa replied honestly, "but I think we might have a serious problem." Lisa picked up the phone and dialed the number for Naval Intelligence that appeared at the bottom of the computer message. She expected to reach some kind of automated system, or maybe a low-level clerk who could help clear up the confusion. Instead, she found herself talking to a very serious-sounding woman who identified herself as a duty officer. "This is Sergeant Parker with the Millfield Police Department," Lisa said. "I am trying to verify the military service of a man named Thomas Mitchell, who we have in custody." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Did you say Thomas Mitchell?" the duty officer asked. "Yes, ma'am. We arrested him on stolen valor charges this morning." Another pause. Longer this time. "Sergeant Parker, I need you to hold on one moment while I contact my supervisor. This is a very unusual situation." Lisa waited on hold for nearly 10 minutes, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Danny stood beside her, no longer looking confident about his arrest. The fact that Naval Intelligence was taking this call so seriously suggested that Thomas Mitchell might not be the ordinary con artist they had assumed. When the duty officer came back on the line, her voice was urgent. "Sergeant Parker, I have Admiral Rebecca Hayes on another line who wants to speak with you immediately. She is flying to your location and should arrive within 2 hours. Under no circumstances should you question or move the prisoner until she arrives." "Admiral," Lisa repeated, feeling her stomach drop. "Ma'am, can you tell me what this is about?" "I cannot give you details over an unsecured line, but I can tell you that Thomas Mitchell is not just any veteran. His service record is classified. At the highest levels, you have arrested someone whose military background is a matter of national security." Lisa felt dizzy as the implications hit her. "Are you saying we made a mistake?" "Sergeant, you have arrested one of the most decorated intelligence officers in modern naval history. Whatever you think you know about this man, you are wrong. Admiral Hayes will explain everything when she arrives, but for now, treat Thomas Mitchell with the respect that a highly decorated veteran deserves." The line went dead, leaving Lisa staring at the phone in shock. She looked at Danny, whose face had gone pale as he realized the magnitude of his error. "We arrested a real hero," Danny whispered, sinking into a chair. "I handcuffed someone who actually served his country." Lisa walked quickly toward the holding cells, her mind racing with questions. How could a small town like Millfield be home to a highly classified naval intelligence officer? Why had Thomas Mitchell never mentioned his real background? And most importantly, how were they going to explain this mistake to their superiors? When Lisa reached Thomas's cell, she found him sitting calmly on the bench, reading a magazine someone had left behind. He looked up at her with patient eyes that showed no anger or resentment despite the terrible situation they had put him in. "Mr. Mitchell," Lisa said quietly, "I think we owe you a very big apology." Thomas smiled slightly. "Admiral Hayes called, I assume." Lisa nodded, amazed that he seemed to know exactly what was happening. "She is on her way here. Sir, I have to ask, why did not you tell us who you really were?" Thomas stood up and straightened his shirt. "Sergeant, I spent my entire career keeping secrets. Old habits are hard to break even when they might have saved me some trouble." As they waited for Admiral Hayes to arrive, Lisa could not help but wonder what kind of secrets a man like Thomas Mitchell had kept, and what kind of service he had given that required such extraordinary classification. In just a few hours, their quiet little police station was about to become the center of a story that would change how everyone in Millfield understood the meaning of heroism. The Millfield police station had never seen anything like what happened that Tuesday afternoon. At exactly 2:15, a convoy of black cars pulled into the parking lot, followed by a military helicopter that landed in the empty field behind the building. Chief of Police Robert Chen had been called back from his day off and was now standing in his office, trying to understand how his quiet department had become the center of what looked like a federal emergency. Admiral Rebecca Hayes stepped out of the lead car wearing her dress uniform, followed by 3 men in dark suits and 2 Pentagon officials who had flown in from Washington. The Admiral was 60 years old with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail around her. When she walked, people automatically stepped aside to let her pass. Chief Chen had been a police officer for 25 years, but he had never dealt with anyone whose presence commanded this much respect. When Admiral Hayes entered his office, he felt like a rookie meeting his first real authority figure. The Pentagon officials introduced themselves with titles that Chief Chen had only heard in movies. "Chief Chen," Admiral Hayes said, her voice crisp and professional, "I understand you have Thomas Mitchell in custody on stolen valor charges. I am here to correct what appears to be a very serious misunderstanding." Officer Danny Rodriguez sat in the corner of the office, looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. He had gone from feeling proud of his arrest to realizing he had made the biggest mistake of his career. Sergeant Lisa Parker stood beside him, still trying to process what she had learned from the phone calls. Admiral Hayes opened a leather briefcase and pulled out a thick folder marked with security classifications that made Chief Chen's eyes widen. "Gentlemen," she began, "the man you arrested this morning has served his country in ways that most people cannot imagine. I am going to tell you what I can, but understand that much of Thomas Mitchell's service record will remain classified forever." She opened the folder and began reading from documents that looked nothing like ordinary military records. Thomas Mitchell enlisted in the Navy in 1985 at age 19. He was selected for intelligence training after scoring in the top 1% on all aptitude tests. For the next 32 years, he served in naval intelligence, specializing in deep cover operations in hostile territories. Danny felt sick to his stomach as he listened. This was not the story of a fake soldier making up heroic tales. This was the real thing, and he had arrested a genuine American hero, Admiral Hayes. Continued reading. "Thomas has operated undercover in 17 different countries, many of them places where discovery would have meant certain death. He has prevented terrorist attacks that the public will never know about. He has gathered intelligence that helped end conflicts before they could start. He has saved countless lives through his work." Chief Chen found his voice. "Admiral, why does he live here in our small town? Why did not he tell us who he was?" "After retirement, many intelligence officers choose to live quietly," Admiral Hayes explained. "Thomas earned that right. He wanted a peaceful life where no one knew about his past. He has been wounded in action 4 times, tortured by enemy agents twice, and spent 18 months in a foreign prison on a mission that officially never happened. She pulled out a photograph from the folder and placed it on Chief Chen's desk. The photo showed a younger Thomas Mitchell in military dress, uniform, standing next to 3 different presidents as they pinned medals on his chest. Thomas has been decorated by Presidents Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. He holds the Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, among others. Danny stared at the photograph, seeing the quiet man from the coffee shop in a completely different light. The Thomas Mitchell in the photo looked confident and proud, surrounded by the most powerful people in America. Danny had handcuffed this man and accused him of being a fraud. Most of his awards are classified, Admiral Hayes continued. The public versions of his citations do not mention the real details of what he did. Thomas has infiltrated terrorist organizations, rescued captured American agents, and conducted operations that prevented international incidents from becoming wars. One of the Pentagon officials spoke up. Admiral Hayes, should we tell them about the Moscow operation? Admiral, Hayes considered for a moment. The basics, yes. In 1994, Thomas spent 8 months undercover in Russia, posing as a businessman while gathering intelligence about nuclear weapons being sold on the black market. His work led to the recovery of weapons-grade uranium that could have been used to build dirty bombs. The operation was so sensitive that only 12 people in the entire government knew about it. Chief Chen felt overwhelmed by what he was hearing. A real-life spy had been living in their town for 3 years, and they had arrested him for pretending to be a soldier. Admiral, how do we fix this mistake? First, you release Thomas immediately with a full apology, Admiral Hayes said firmly. Second, you understand that this incident must be handled with complete discretion. Thomas chose to live here because he wanted privacy. That privacy must be protected. She pulled out another document and handed it to Chief Chen. This is a letter from the Secretary of Defense, asking that Thomas Mitchell be treated with the respect due to one of America's most valuable intelligence assets. He may be retired, but his service to this country is beyond question. Sergeant Parker finally found her courage to speak. Ma'am, we had a report of stolen valor in the area. Thomas was trying to report the real criminal when we arrested him. By mistake. Admiral Hayes raised an eyebrow. You mean Thomas called in the report himself? Yes, ma'am. He saw someone in a fake uniform and called the police. Officer Rodriguez misunderstood and thought Thomas was the suspect. For the first time since arriving, Admiral Hayes smiled slightly. That sounds exactly like Thomas. Even in retirement, he cannot stand to see people dishonor the military. He has always had a strong sense of right and wrong. She stood up and closed the folder. Chief Chen, I want to see Thomas now. We have not spoken in over a year, and I owe him an apology for taking so long to get here. As they walked toward the holding cells, Admiral Hayes turned to Officer Rodriguez. Son, you made an honest mistake. Thomas will not hold it against you, but let this be a lesson about making assumptions. Sometimes the quietest people have the most extraordinary stories. When they reached Thomas's cell, they found him sitting calmly on the bench, looking completely relaxed, despite having spent hours behind bars. When he saw Admiral Hayes, his face lit up with genuine happiness. Rebecca, Thomas said, standing up and smoothing his shirt. You did not have to come all this way. Like hell I did not, Admiral Hayes replied, her formal tone disappearing. When I heard that some small-town police had arrested Thomas Mitchell for stolen valor, I thought someone was playing a practical joke. Chief Chen unlocked the cell door, his hands shaking slightly as he realized he was releasing someone whose service record read like a thriller novel. Thomas stepped out and shook hands with each of the officers, showing no anger or resentment toward the people who had wrongly imprisoned him. No hard feelings, Thomas said to Danny, who looked like he was about to cry. You were trying to protect the honor of real veterans. That instinct is not wrong. You just had the wrong target. As they walked toward the front of the station, Admiral Hayes put her hand on Thomas's shoulder. Tom, I think your quiet retirement just got a lot more complicated. Thomas chuckled. Well, Rebecca, it was getting a little boring anyway. The release of Thomas Mitchell from the Millfield police station was handled as quietly as possible. But word had already spread through the small town that something big was happening. People had seen the black cars and the military helicopter, and rumors were flying faster than facts. By the time Thomas walked out of the police station, half the town knew that their quiet neighbor was somehow connected to a major government operation. Chief Chen personally escorted Thomas to the front door, offering apologies that seemed inadequate for the situation. "Mr. Mitchell, I cannot express how sorry we are for this mistake. If there is anything the department can do to make this right." Thomas adjusted his navy cap and looked at the chief with understanding eyes. "Chief, your officer was doing his job. He saw what he thought was a crime and took action. I respect that, even if the outcome was not what anyone expected." Admiral Hayes walked beside Thomas as they headed toward her car. She had decided to stay in Millfield for the rest of the day, partly to handle the bureaucratic aftermath of the incident, but mostly to spend time with her old friend. It had been too long since they had talked, and this crisis had reminded her how much she valued their friendship. Officer Danny Rodriguez approached Thomas one more time before he left. The young officer's face was red with embarrassment, but he forced himself to look Thomas in the eye. "Sir, I need to apologize again. I thought I was protecting the honor of real veterans, but instead, I arrested one of the most honorable men I will ever meet." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face Danny directly. He could see that the young man was genuinely sorry and struggling with the weight of his mistake. Thomas had been in situations where split-second decisions had life or death consequences, and he understood how easy it was to get things wrong when you were trying to do the right thing. "Son," Thomas said quietly, "you have nothing to be ashamed of. You saw what you thought was someone dishonoring the military, and you took action. That tells me you have good instincts and respect for people who serve. Do not let this mistake break your spirit. Good police officers learn from their errors and become better because of them." Danny felt some of the weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you, sir. I promise I will learn from this." "I know you will," Thomas replied, shaking the young officer's hand. "And Danny, the next time someone reports stolen valor, ask more questions before you make an arrest. The real criminals usually want attention. The real heroes often try to avoid it." As they walked away from the police station, Admiral Hayes filled Thomas in on what had happened to the actual stolen valor case. The fake soldier had been arrested 2 hours earlier when someone finally pointed him out to police. Unlike Thomas, the imposter had no military service whatsoever and was carrying obviously fraudulent documents. "The irony is incredible," Admiral Hayes said, shaking her head. "While you were sitting in jail for supposedly faking military service, the real faker was still out there telling his lies to anyone who would listen." They stopped at Danny's diner for coffee, where Marie nearly dropped her pot when she saw Thomas walk in with a woman in a Navy admiral's uniform. The lunch crowd fell silent as they took a corner table, and Marie could not help but stare as she brought their coffee. "Thomas," Marie said quietly, "I heard there was some kind of mix-up at the police station. Are you okay?" "I am fine, Marie," Thomas replied with his usual gentle smile. "Just a case of mistaken identity. Nothing to worry about." Admiral Hayes watched the interaction with interest. She could see that Thomas had built a good life in this small town, surrounded by people who cared about him, even though they knew almost nothing about his real background. It was exactly what he had wanted. After 32 years of living undercover, "You know," Admiral Hayes said after Marie walked away, "when you first told me you were retiring to some tiny town in the middle of nowhere, I thought you were making a mistake. I figured you would be bored within 6 months." Thomas laughed, softly. "I was bored. That was the point. After 3 decades of never knowing if I would wake up in a friendly country or an enemy prison, boredom sounded like paradise. And now?" Admiral Hayes asked. "Now I think my quiet retirement just became a lot more complicated," Thomas admitted. "By tomorrow, everyone in town will know that I am not just some regular Navy veteran. The story will grow with each telling, until people think I was personally responsible for ending the Cold War." Admiral Hayes sipped her coffee and studied her old friend's face. "Are you okay with that?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I suppose it was bound to happen eventually. I just hoped I would have a few more years of anonymity." There is something peaceful about being nobody special. Thomas, you have never been nobody special. You just spent a few years pretending to be ordinary. As they talked, word of Thomas's arrest and release continued to spread through Millfield. Frank and Joe from the breakfast crowd had already called several friends to tell them about the morning's drama. Mrs. Peterson had seen the military cars and was telling everyone at the grocery store that Thomas must be some kind of war hero. The story was growing and changing with each conversation. By late afternoon, Thomas and Admiral Hayes made their way to the town square where the Veterans Day ceremony was about to begin. The same volunteers who had watched Thomas get arrested that morning were now setting up the final decorations, stealing glances at him and whispering among themselves. Jake, the young man Thomas had helped with the sound system, approached them, nervously. "Mr. Mitchell, I heard what happened today. I just wanted to say thank you for your service, and I am sorry about the confusion." "Thank you, Jake," Thomas replied. "And thank you for organizing this ceremony. It means a lot to veterans to know that people remember." The ceremony coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Susan, hurried over to them with an anxious expression. "Mr. Mitchell, we heard about what happened today. Would you consider saying a few words at the ceremony? We would be honored to have you speak." Thomas looked at Admiral Hayes, who nodded encouragingly. He had spent his entire career avoiding public attention, but maybe it was time to step into the light, at least for a few minutes. "I would be honored," Thomas said simply. As the afternoon crowd gathered for the ceremony, Thomas found himself surrounded by people who had known him as the quiet man from the coffee shop, but were now seeing him in a completely different way. Children who had never paid attention to him before were staring with wide eyes. Adults who had exchanged polite greetings were now looking at him with something approaching awe. When it came time for Thomas to speak, he walked to the microphone with the same calm confidence he had shown all day. The crowd fell completely silent as he looked out at the faces of his neighbors and friends. "I did not expect to be speaking today," Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "This morning I was just Thomas from the diner. This afternoon, through a series of unexpected events, you have learned that I am also retired Navy intelligence." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want you to know that the most important thing about me is not what I did during my military service. The most important thing is that I am your neighbor, your friend, and a member of this community that has given me so much peace and happiness." The crowd listened intently as Thomas continued. "Real heroes do not seek recognition. They serve because it is right, not because they want praise. Today we honor all veterans, but especially those who came home quietly and built good lives in places like Millfield. The greatest victory is not winning a war. It is coming home and finding peace." When Thomas finished speaking, the applause was long and heartfelt. Admiral Hayes watched from the side of the stage, proud of her friend and amazed once again by his ability to handle any situation with grace and wisdom. As the ceremony ended and people began to leave, Thomas was surrounded by well-wishers and curious neighbors. He answered their questions patiently, but without going into details that were still classified. He was no longer the mysterious quiet man, but he was not yet ready to become the town celebrity either. Walking home that evening with Admiral Hayes, Thomas reflected on the strangest day of his retirement. "You know, Rebecca, I think this might actually work out okay. Now I can be honest about my Navy service without having to lie about the details." "And," Admiral Hayes asked, "and maybe it is time for Thomas Mitchell to stop hiding and start living like the hero he has always been."